The nominations to the peerage were made in time was now pressing. The emperor opened the session of the legislative body with the usual forms and ceremonies. When in the hall, he was received with the loudest acclamations, and after the oaths were taken by the members of both chambers, he addressed them in a speech pointing out the dangers which the country was threatened. He implored them to adopt measures calculated to preserve the country from the invasion which it was threatened on every side to postpone until the storm was over all abstract discussions, and not to imitate the example of the Greeks of the Lower Empire who only made speeches while the battering ram of the enemy was beating down their walls. The Chamber of Deputies were well satisfied with this speech, as it gave full explanation upon all the points which had formed subject of misunderstanding. In 1814, there was then reason to anticipate some firm and decided measures from an assembly which declared itself satisfied. A few days after the emperor's arrival at Paris, he was much pressed to settle the constitution of the country, that he found it impossible to wait for the meeting of the legislature in order to submit that matter to the deliberation of the deputies. The public mind was indeed so much agitated on this question that there was reason to apprehend resistance in matters of the greatest importance, unless immediate satisfaction were given. In consequence of this state of the public feeling, the emperor directed Messieurs Benjamin Constant, Bedoc, and some other members of the late Chamber of Deputies to meet together for the purpose of compiling and digesting whatever had been done or said in the different national assemblies with reference to the constitutions which France had at various times adopted, and to draw upon a summary capable of satisfying the public impatience. Unfortunately, the materials to be compiled were too considerable and the time too short to admit of the revision of all the anterior constitutions and the composing therefrom the plan of a constitution suited to the wants of the moment. No other title was therefore given to the result of those gentlemen's labors than that of additional act to the constitutions of the state. The articles of this document were found to be extremely liberal. The publicists were satisfied with it. Even Madame de Staël applauded the provisions which the act contained in a letter to the Prince of Blank. She says, the additional articles are all that is wanted for France, nothing less and nothing more than what she wants. And as if it seemed that something of self must always find its way into whatever appears most disinterested, she adds, the return of the emperor is prodigious and surpasses all imagination. I recommend my son to you. The suffrage of Madame de Staël was no doubt of some value, as was also that of the cohort of Genevieve's publicists who followed her in the same tone of approbation, but no respect was paid to the lucubrations of these foreigners. The work was attacked in its very title. It was censured out of all reason and out of all measure, even by those who had not taken the trouble to read it. Malevolence, which unfortunately is always sure to find abundance of echoes in France, was evidently at work. 8 days were spent in vituperation. At last, the angry feelings subsided to such a degree that when the chamber assembled, no discussion took place on the additional act, which was then very generally approved. Several persons have expressed the opinion that the emperor ought to have abdicated at the Champ de Mai, leaving it to the Chamber of Deputies to govern and save the state, either by negotiation with the enemy or by rousing the national energy to triumph over the disappointment if negotiation should not prove successful. They allege that, as the enemy had, by the declaration of the 13th of March, stated that war was made against the emperor alone, it became that prince to detach himself entirely from the question in order that it might be clearly seen whether the allied sovereigns were insincere in the sentiments they manifested. In that case, the chamber would have appointed for the government an executive committee composed of members of the high character and out of the reach of all suspicion of being influenced by the enemy. This committee would have transferred its authority to the emperor upon finding that the declaration was only a deception contrived to paralyze the efforts of the nation. On the contrary, if the allies granted what the nation required, then a provision would have been made for the emperor suitable to the dignity of the country and the gratitude due to its deliverer from dangers, the recollection of which could not easily be forgotten. It was Fouché who gave currency to these ideas, and he had his reasons for so doing. An abdication would have afforded him the opportunity of more easily resuming the projects in which he was engaged before the emperor's return from Elba. He would have been master of the field and would have made arrangements with foreigners to his own advantage. Another consideration had also its weight with him. He was aware that his conduct had awakened suspicion, and it's very evident that the first sacrifice which the traitor would have proposed that the nation should make to the allies would have been to deliver up the emperor, a measure which he could then, placed at the head of the government, have easily carried into execution. The truth of this opinion will appear less questionable when it is considered that his future security required the sacrifice of the emperor at all hazards, for it is worthy of remark that the parties of Vienna refused to undertake anything until that prince should previously be removed from the islet of Elba. Fouché took good care not to avow the reports which all his industry was exerted in propagating. He had too much sense to suppose that the emperor had come to expel the Bourbons for the purpose of afterwards transferring France into the hands of a few intriguers, and too much sagacity to flatter himself that he could long conceal the object of his machinations. I sincerely believe, however, that if he had, on the arrival of that prince, explained to him the state of his negotiations with the allies and been able to prove to him that, had it not been for his return, he would have succeeded. The emperor would not have wished a drop of blood to be shed for that which could be obtained without him. If Fouché was as fully assured of success as he had pretended he was, nothing can excuse him for not having confided his secret to the emperor. He is the more blamable, as the acknowledgment, far from injuring him, might even have been the means of raising his credit with the emperor, at the same time that it would have assured his popularity with the nation. May it not then be concluded that the cause of his silence on this delicate subject was that he distrusted the promises transmitted to him from Vienna, and that he therefore felt it necessary to attach himself to the emperor? On the other hand, he must have perceived that if he divulged the project in which he was engaged before the return from Elba, and the emperor failed to maintain himself, he would then stand in a disadvantageous situation with respect to the new government, which would not fail to call upon him for an account of his conduct. The emperor had heard of Fouché's negotiation, and the letter ceased on the courier from Vienna had afforded him some materials for reflection, but as the minister did not speak to him on the subject, he could not regard the affair otherwise than as an intrigue, on the success of which its promoters themselves did not much rely. There was no motive for making a mystery of an affair which it was perfectly natural to avow, for the emperor, who had not communicated his intention to return to any individual, could not be displeased to find that attempts were making by others to throw off a yoke of which all complained. Fouché was fully persuaded that the destiny of France depended on the resolutions of the Congress, but the campaign being about to open in Flanders, he considered that if we experienced a reverse in that quarter, English armies would arrive first at Paris, and that the fate of that capital would then depend more on the English general than on the commanders of the other armies which were still beyond the Rhine. He felt, therefore, that he had no time to spare and immediately opened a communication with the Duke of Wellington. By this precaution, he was prepared for all events. If the emperor triumphed, he reserved for him the embarrassments which he was creating in the Chamber of Deputies and among the men who had taken part in the movements of the Revolution. There is no doubt that he would have hampered and retarded the measures of the government by extinguishing the hope of its consolidation. Finally, he had a last resource, the death of the emperor. That crime would not have been difficult of accomplishment, for the assassin might have relied on impunity, as he could not have been secured if the police minister wished him to escape. I have conversed with many persons who had been acquainted with Fouché for 20 years, and they fully concurred in my opinion, to such a degree that Fouché carried dissimulation that when I met him a few days after the emperor's departure for Flanders, he said to me, "It is impossible to preserve attachment to the emperor, for no one is safe with him. He suspects everybody of betraying him." This was his language after he had written to the Duke of Wellington. It is impossible to repress astonishment at the emperor having again employed this man. An error of such magnitude proves how completely ignorant he was of the plots which had been hatching at Paris before his return. Chapter 4. The emperor left Paris to take the command of the army on the 10th or 11th of June. He proceeded first to Avesnes and assembled a troop on the bank of the Sambre between Maubeuge and Charleroi. I was not with the army and shall therefore only briefly sketch the events of this unfortunate campaign. The emperor's army was not very numerous, but it was in good condition and animated by the best spirit. It was inferior in cavalry to the enemy's army, which it, however, surpassed in the quality of its infantry and more particularly in its artillery. The time which remained for placing the frontier in security by a decisive blow was limited. The emperor had to expect the arrival of the Russian and Austrian armies on the Rhine in the month of July. It was therefore necessary that he should be on that river at the same period. The corps of Suchet at Lyon and of General Lecourbe at Beaufort were feeble, but they were daily reinforced by new levies, which, being called out as the only means of saving the country, were actively forwarded. That the emperor did not sooner put them in motion was because he considered it more advantageous to wait until they were completed in order to avail himself of them in the second part of his operations. The Bavarian army, which was 25,000 strong, occupied the territory of Dupont and was marching to form a junction with the Anglo-Prussian army. The emperor, who had reason to reckon on the favorable sentiments of these troops, who had been sounded a month before, wished to engage the Anglo-Prussian army before the Bavarians could take part in its operation, because on the day after a successful battle they would have declared for him, either from the revival of their former attachment or from the necessity in which the fortune of war would have placed them. The Bavarians advanced by forced marches to join the Anglo-Prussians, and the nearer they approached the lower Meuse, the more they would have got involved in the snares we had laid for them. Had fortune favored us at Waterloo, the corps which was in Lorraine and which was daily augmenting, following along the frontier the movement which the Bavaries were making beyond it, the emperor concentrated his corps in the neighborhood of Thionville. His reason for doing so will speedily be seen. All the frontier fortresses from the sea to the Rhine were garrisoned with National Guards. They could not certainly be considered good troops in the field of battle, but we could have employed them usefully in 1,000 ways in those operations which become easy after a battle has been gained. Whenever an event fails to realize the hopes previously formed respecting it, the plans which have had an unfavorable issue are sure to be blamed. The tactics of the leader are criticized, his combinations censured, and only what he has not done is pronounced to be right. This is precisely what happened to the emperor. He was treated without mercy. Officers previously unknown were suddenly transformed into great military chiefs. To hear them talk, it was only necessary to have given them the command, and the destruction of the enemy's army was certain. It is very true that all was lost by the Battle of Waterloo, but the battle itself lost through the maneuvers which led to it and the improvidence of him who directed them. Or did we fail through a combination of unfortunate circumstances and looked for accidents? This I will endeavor to explain. With the exception of General Rapp's corps, the emperor had taken all his disposable troops to that principal theater of operations so that they might be ready to be employed when wanted. He certainly did not give the enemy battle with the prospect of being defeated, and he had more chances of success than of reverse. The disaster was doubtless greater perhaps than is imagined, for it is only by comparing it with the brilliant advantages which victory would have secured that we can measure the depth of the abyss into which we were plunged. Every patriotic Frenchman must shed bitter tears when he reflects on what a few generous efforts more might have effected. For my part, I have never tasted happiness since I learned with positive certainty how nearly we had consolidated forever the edifice of glory which we had been 20 years in raising. The Prime Minister of England communicated a long detail to the Parliament on the operations of the different combined armies during this short campaign. Some months before, he said to induce Parliament to take part in the war, which he had rekindled on the Emperor's return, that there could be no doubt of success and that the operations would not last 6 weeks. The result verified the assertion of the English minister, though there is good reason to believe that he himself did not expect so speedy and so advantageous a fulfillment. of his prediction. However, the probability is that he had learned his lesson 2 ways and was prepared for anything that might ensue. We are even justified in believing that he deceived Parliament when, in detailing the events which annihilated France, he assured the House of Commons that if it had the result of the Battle of Waterloo been the reverse of what it was, the success of the Allies was nevertheless certain, because the Emperor Alexander would have arrived with such strong masses of troops that he must speedily have secured the victory and repaired any reverses which the Anglo-Prussian army might have sustained. This opinion, with whatever confidence it might be expressed, does not very well accord with the following fact, which is strictly true. On the Emperor's return from the Isle of Elba, the French had in the Levant, under the command of Monsieur de Saussure, a division consisting of a frigate, a corvette, 2 brigs, and 2 golettes. As soon as war was declared, the English dispatched in pursuit of this division a squadron consisting of 2 frigates of the same force as the French frigate, to which were added a corvette and 2 brigs, one of which was very large. Thus the chances were entirely in their favor. The English commodore began to look out for the French division and sailed to Smyrna, where he had hoped to fall in with it, but in spite of all his diligence, he did not arrive there until after the departure of Monsieur de Saussure for Toulon, whither he had received orders to proceed. The English commodore remained at Smyrna, and he was there when intelligence reached that city the disasters of Waterloo and the abdication which they occasioned. The English officers evinced their mortification at an event which frustrated their hopes of promotion. "Console yourselves," said the commodore, "for even had we fallen in with the French squadron, we could not have attacked it. My orders were merely to observe it, and until I received fresh instructions, I should not have fired a single gun, even though the tricolored flag had been hoisted." Now, however well assured Lord Castlereagh might have been of the issue of the military operations, even in the event of the Battle of Waterloo being lost, still it may be asked, why was the English Navy prevented from contributing to a success in which England was so deeply interested? It may certainly be presumed that Lord Castlereagh was not really so confident of success as he pretended to be, and that in case of a reverse, which might be readily apprehended, he was prepared to treat independently with France for so doing. He would have pleaded as his excuse with the Allies the disasters which the English army must inevitably have endured had 2 battles been lost, and perhaps he would even have complained of the tardiness with which the combined powers had come forward to support the Duke of Wellington. If the Prime Minister of England did not form this plan of extricating himself from his difficulties, we must necessarily suppose that he intended to abandon the coalition in case the war had been protracted, instead of terminating as speedily as he declared it would when he applied for the assistance of Parliament. It was probably with this last view that he gave eventual orders to the officers of the Navy, wishing to avoid the embarrassment of complicated questions when the convenient moment should arrive for treating with the Emperor. This, moreover, proves that he perceived before his departure from Vienna a disposition to such an adjustment. But fate, which rules the destiny of states, decided otherwise, and there is nothing more to be said upon the subject. However, in spite of the invectives which the Prime Minister of England lavished on the great man who was doomed to expiate errors which he could not foresee, it is nevertheless certain that the confidence that minister affected to possess was not really felt by him. Lord Castlereagh was no doubt a clever politician, but the subject here in question is military probabilities, and surely those whose whole lives have been devoted to the profession of war are not bound to adopt all his views. I will here venture to make an observation on the probable success which the Russian and Austrian armies might have obtained. Both advanced down the Rhine, the Russians by way of Bamberg and the Austrians by Bavaria. To all appearances, these forces would have directed their march towards the upper Rhine. This is the more probable, as we were no longer in possession of the bridge of Metz. They would besides have taken this course to avoid our fortresses, to penetrate into France by a road with which they were acquainted, and if necessary to communicate to Switzerland with the armies in Italy. If they did not again advance by the way of Bâle, they would have left a still better game in the hands of the Emperor, who might have taken an immediate position whence he could have maneuvered successfully on the one or the other. But on whatever point of the Rhine they should have presented themselves, the following might have been the Emperor's operations after gaining the Battle of Waterloo. I haven't believed that what I'm about to state by supposition really was his plan. In the first place, it may be remarked that had that great event taken place according to the way in which it was planned, the English army would have been completely destroyed, a fate from which it indeed narrowly escaped. The Prussians would have experienced nearly a similar fate, and probably on the following day, for in the position in which the affair would have been decided, the French army would have had a shorter march in descending the Meuse to prevent Blucher from repassing that river than the general would have had to reach any point of it were he could have possessed himself of the advantage of a bridge. Thus, a day sooner or later, when fairly separate from the English army, his destruction was inevitable. He had already been so separated, and it was only necessary to prevent him from forming a new junction after such success. What could have prevented the emperor from passing the Meuse at Liège? And in that case, what would have become of the Bavarian corps? It would have been the more readily intercepted as it was marching to join the Anglo-Prussians. The Bavarians would then have done what they did in 1813. They would have ranged themselves on the side favored by fortune from Liège. What would have prevented the emperor from effecting a passage across the Moselle, down the right bank of which he would have brought the corps he had assembled in the neighborhood of Thionville? From any point of the Moselle to the Rhine, of what consideration would be the distance to a victorious army? The Battle of Waterloo was fought on the 18th of June, and it was not therefore unreasonable to presume that the emperor might, on the 10th of July, have arrived at some point of the lower Rhine before Strasbourg. On reaching the river, he would have had the choice of 3 different points for crossing it, viz., the bridge of Strasbourg, or between that city and the Neckar, or between the Neckar and the Main, and whichever passage he chose. He would still have found himself with the whole of his victorious army at the extremity of one of the wings of the enemy's grand army, and threatening its line of operations, particularly of its march, was already taken in the direction of Bâle. According to the hypothesis here submitted, the fate of this prodigious coalition must have been decided by a great event, after a few combinations of marches and maneuvers, such as the emperor well knew how to execute. If he had happened to begin on the right of this Austro-Russian army, fine scenes would have occurred. All those pretended geniuses, for whom a series of base treacheries has procured the title of great captains, would have shown themselves still only so many schoolboys, and would for the 10th time have taken to their heels after receiving a sound whipping. In such case, what would the Emperor of Austria and the Confederated Princes have done? They would not certainly have exposed themselves to pay all the charges of war merely for the sake of the Russians. They would have treated with him whom fortune had crowned, and whom she had again brought to their gates. Had this taken place, how would the Russian army have been situated? By what route could it have avoided the Emperor's army, which would then have been reinforced at least by the corps of General de Courbe, as well as by the garrisons of our fortresses, which could no longer have stood in need of defenders? The emperor would have been on ground with the topography of which he was familiar, and had Alexander been disposed to try his hand at the chances of battle, he would have paid a score which would never have allowed him to forget the game at which he had played. The more numerous his troops, the greater would have been his loss. He was not capable of maneuvering with the rapidity of the emperor, who had a perfect command of the mechanism of masses. This is a point of view under which it would appear Lord Castlereagh did not look at the question when he asserted in Parliament that had the Battle of Waterloo been lost, the issue of the contest would have been only postponed, but it is more probable that it was because he had considered it in all its bearings, that he reserved for himself the means of treating with the emperor, and that it was in consequence of that determination that he gave to the officers of English ships of war those eventual orders to which I have alluded. What can Frenchmen think when they learn on what the destiny of their country depended? Must they not admit that if the battle had been gained and the English army had sustained such loss as to render negotiations with the emperor necessary? The letter which Mr. Fouché acknowledges he wrote on the 15th of June to the Duke of Wellington would have sufficed to revive the hopes of that general. Hence, however great the defeat, he would have had no reason to consider his game as decidedly lost, since he had in his interest the very man whose duty it was to watch over the safety of the emperor. What ought to be the reward of such perfidy? Let us now see what were the operations of the emperor's army, and by what series of unfortunate occurrences. The Battle of Waterloo was lost. Chapter 5. The emperor struck the first blow in the commencement of the campaign and had the good fortune to surprise the enemy while preparing to concentrate his force. This was a great advantage, which he proposed to follow up vigorously. His plan of attack was settled. He knew the character of the generals who opposed him. He considered that Blucher, governed by his ardent and enthusiastic temperament, would boldly draw the sword the moment he heard of our approach, and that if he had but 2 battalions with him, he would, with the patriotic spirit of self-denial, instantly face us and endeavor to retard the advance of our masses in order to allow the English time to concentrate. Not so the Duke of Wellington, methodical and circumspect. It was certain that he would not hazard an engagement until the whole of his forces were concentrated. The emperor was guided by these considerations in directing his operations. He opened the campaign with from 110,000 to 113,000 men. Of these, he composed 2 masses, the principals of which, consisting of about 60,000 men, he directed on Fleurus, at which place he knew the Prussians were assembling. He ordered Marshal Ney to advance at the other on the road to Brussels and to make himself master of the position at Quatre Bras to hinder the English from supporting their allies. The emperor conjectured rightly. Blucher was already in position at Fleurus. A force of 90,000 men, covered by a steep ravine, were posted between Saint-Amand and Sombref. Everything indicated a sanguinary action. This disposition of his army served, however, to betray the motives which had influenced the enemy's general. It was evident he hoped to overawe the French army, and that he would only hazard an engagement with a view to give the rest of the Allied troops time to come into line. Marshal Ney had been detached to Quatre Bras. He was, as I have already observed, to prevent the Prussians from receiving the aid they expected. The event then could not have been doubtful. The action began. Vandamme directed his march against Saint-Amand. Gerard advanced upon Ligny. Grouchy upon Sombref. In a moment, from left to right, all of the corps were engaged. The resistance was as obstinate as the attack was sudden. The efforts of the enemy began, however, to relax, and General Gerard was on the point of carrying Ligny when a numerous column was observed debouching on our left. The Imperial Guard, which was to have supported Gerard, suspended its movement in order to meet the supposed hostile masses. It was soon, however, discovered that a false alarm had been raised. The troops whose approach had occasioned so much apprehension being no other than the First Corps, which had come up on hearing the firing. The guard resumed its movement. Ligny was carried, and the Prussians compelled to retire from the field. We lost, however, 2 hours in consequence of the unexpected appearance of Count Erlon's corps, and the shade of night soon covered the retreat of the vanquished. But this was not all. The false movement of the First Corps, which may be said to have nullified the results of this action, or at the best, to have converted into an ordinary affair of battle, which should have been decisive, had another consequence not less unfortunate. Marshal Ney, who was to have taken possession of Quatre Bras, was anticipated, and the position was covered by the enemy's troops when he arrived to occupy it. He had left the Second Corps at Frasne, and had with him but from 18,000 men. He nevertheless paused not a moment, but advancing on the masses opposed to him, broke them, and was preparing to pursue them when 2 divisions of fresh troops arrived to their succor. Pressed by this increase of force, he called up the troops of the First Corps. But they were then distant, executing that movement which had so fatal an effect on the Emperor's plans. As evening set in, they countermarched, and about 9 o'clock re-entered Frasne. But all was then over, and the corps, which both at Quatre Bras and at Fleurus might have completed the destruction of the enemy, contributed to save him. Such was the decree of fate. The efforts of the marshal were not, however, useless, for it was afterwards ascertained that the Prussians would not have fought the battle had they not been assured of support. Wellington, who hastened to their headquarters before the action commenced, informed them that his army would be assembled at 2 o'clock at Quatre Bras, and at 4 would debouch at Saint-Amand. His intention was to attack our flank, to force in our left wing and sweep it away. His columns accordingly began to march The marshal himself advanced to meet them. He gave them a severe shock, which checked them and prevented them from uniting their efforts to those of the Prussians. Blucher was retreating, and the emperor prepared to march upon the English. The rout of Fleurus had obliged them to evacuate the position which they had so obstinately defended. He determined to pursue them with all speed and to march on Brussels in 2 columns, one composed of Girard and Vandame's corps, and the cavalry of Axel's men, under the command of Grouchy, was directed to pursue the Prussian army. The other column, of which the emperor himself took the command, marched directly on Quatre Bras. The emperor joined the marshal, whom he directed to pursue the enemy's rear guard, and which threw itself into the forest of Soigny. The whole of the English army was there, but the night coming on, it was too late to begin an attack, and the emperor took up a position. Unfortunately, the right column had not made near so much progress as the left. The latter had traversed a distance of about 6 leagues. The former had halted at Jean-Bleu, which is now more than 2 leagues from the field of battle. Notwithstanding this unfortunate circumstance, Wellington was not yet perhaps determined on coming to an engagement. But Blucher, whom his adversary allowed quietly to rally his scattered columns, resumed courage and wished to try the chances of another action. He generously intimated to the English general that if he would consent to fight a battle, he would not march with merely 2 corps, as had been required, but would support him with his whole army. To this he attached but one condition, which was that if the French did not attack on the 18th, the assembled Allied forces should next day march to meet them. Old Blucher's courage inspired his ally with confidence, and the battle was determined on. While the Allies were concerting together, our left column still remained inactive and was wasting time in watching and reconnoitering the movements of the Prussian army. The population was devoted to us. The country contained a host of individuals who had served in our ranks and afforded in every respect far greater facilities for obtaining intelligence than were to be found in the countries where we had long carried on war, such as Germany and Poland. Yet to Grouchy maneuvers, which he ought to have defeated, remained a secret, and he announced in the middle of the night that he was still at Jean-Bleu, ignorant whether the Prussians had retired on Brussels or on Liège. He further declared his intention of maneuvering in such a manner as to prevent them from gaining the first of these towns or forming a junction with Wellington. The emperor, although satisfied with this determination, was nevertheless much astonished at the tardiness of the marshal's pursuit. He expected more activity, and at the moment when he believed the greatest diligence was exerted, he learned that Grouchy was still at Jean-Bleu. In the evening, the emperor had informed him that a great battle would be fought the next day, and had ordered him, whatever might be the movements of the Prussians, to endeavor to outflank the left of the English army and to support our right, if it were only by detachments. What Grouchy had resolved to do, according in part with these instructions. The emperor, however, a second time sent him orders to pass the Dyle and to direct his march on Saint-Lambert. But the marshal had sent another dispatch to the major general, in which he stated that he was again in the track of the Prussians, who were retiring on Wavre, and that he was about to pursue them in that direction. Why, after such positive assurances, did the marshal delay his march? Why did he not seek to regain the time which he had lost? Why was he not before Wavre in the morning instead of not arriving there till the evening? Why, at least, did he not avail himself of the bridges with which the Sambre is covered to maintain a communication with the emperor? Why, with so many means of intelligence, did he allow himself to be ignorant of the maneuvers of the enemy? Why did he not endeavor to outmaneuver the enemy instead of stopping to fight a useless battle before Wavre? I know that he refers to a dispatch from the Major General in defense of his inactivity, but that document is far from justifying him, for it even recommends him not to isolate himself, to maneuver in the direction of the Grand Army, and to maintain a communication with it. I doubtless may be wrong in my supposition, but it seems to me that there is a hiatus, that there has been omitted, of course by inadvertence, the completion of the sentence in which the emperor commands the marshal to maneuver towards us. The remainder of the sentence might be something to this effect: to approximate to us as quickly as possible, and to prevent the enemy from penetrating between your corps and our right. I submit my doubts to the marshal, for I am far from suspecting his integrity. I make them known to him the more readily because the letter bears marks of alteration. For who can believe that a battle commenced at noon was gained at 1 o'clock? Who can suspect Marshal Soult of writing such an absurdity? Who can imagine that the Major General would thus attempt to deceive a man of Marshal Grouchy's great experience? There has evidently been a substitution of words in this place. The word should not be gagné, gained, but engagé, commenced. For how could the center of the English, if they were beaten at Waterloo, be still at Mont-Saint-Jean, which was between us and that village? I return to the Emperor's arrangements. The English army had the forest of Soigny in its rear. Ours was in front of Planchenoit. Grouchy was following the Prussians at a distance, which allowed of his being called into the field of battle. Everything presaged a decided victory. Some circumstances, however, diminished our chances. Several deserters who passed over to the enemy in the morning carried him information which he ought not to have possessed. General Bourmont had already given him some days before details respecting the force at the Emperor's disposal. The disposition between the means of attack and defense were thus made known, and the enemy had therefore become more enterprising. It is remarkable in circumstance that a sort of instinct seemed to have forewarned the Emperor of the treason which Bourmont consummated. He had for a long time repulsed that officer and even refused him with marks of displeasure the command of a division which he solicited. The general, in despair, remaining unemployed, had recourse at first to the Count de Lobau. Repelled by him, he addressed himself to General Gerard and solicited the support of Marshal Ney. He pledged his word of honor that he might be relied upon. They had the weakness to believe him and seconded his application. The petitioner, besides, took great care to insist on the share he attributed to himself in determining the resolution of one of his protectors. He never ceased repeating that it was he who had at Lons-le-Saunier influenced the decision of the Prince of Muscovat to join the Emperor. This service has its weight. It seems a pledge for the sentiments of him who had performed it. The Emperor yielded. The consequences are known. The attack commenced on the left. The English troops, with the forest of Soigny in their rear, were spread out to the right and left of the high road which crossed it. If forced on this point, they could not concentrate their wings without the greatest difficulty, consequently ran the risk of being entirely defeated. The Emperor made his dispositions accordingly. He resolved to attack the enemy rigorously on its wings to distract him, to make him waste his strength, and then suddenly falling on his center to break it and cut off his communications. I will not undertake to describe the different phases of the battle. General Gourgaud, an officer whose ability to take a comprehensive view of military operations the Emperor justly valued, has executed this troublesome task. I will not attempt to retouch the picture which he has traced. I will content myself with saying, according to my experience of the manner in which the Emperor conducted an action, that on every occasion when he was obliged to give battle with a force inferior to the enemy's, he was careful in the commencement to husband the efforts in the spirit of his troops by not engaging them too rapidly. He expended his strength only in proportion as the hours marked the approach of night. He thus divided a great battle into several periods. He managed so as to make the conflict become gradually more warm, and always reserved his great effort, his final blow, until an hour or two before night. When the moment arrived, he brought all his resources into action at once, directed them himself, and did not spare the exertions of his cavalry, because then, once disorder is introduced into the enemy's lines, it cannot be remedied on the approach of night, and he usually got a good account next day of what remained in the field. He proposed to follow a similar course at Waterloo, and that was the reason he did not bring into action all his resources. Artillery and other circumstances also prevented him. He learned from the prisoners that the Duke of Wellington expected the Prussian army, which was on its march to rejoin him. This account tallied with the idea the emperor had formed of the enemy's plan. On seeing that the English remained in their position of Mont Saint-Jean, where they could not hope to withstand him without the assistance of their allies, he therefore sent officer after officer to Marshal Grouchy, and as he could not suppose these orders would fail of effect, he did not hesitate to increase the riskiness of the attack by engaging more troops, because the loss which the English thus sustained would have sufficed to enable him to finish by one vigorous effort. On Marshal Grouchy's arrival, he knew the marshal too well to doubt his punctuality. If the emperor had contented himself with merely observing the English army and waiting for Grouchy's corps, nothing would have prevented the English from commencing a retreat. On seeing Grouchy debouch, he wished to guard against this result, and therefore caused the English army to be pressed so closely as to render a retrograde movement, if not impossible, at least very dangerous. The attack soon grew warm, and unfortunately the emperor suffered much from an indisposition which is common to men who, like him, undergo great fatigues. Riding on horseback had this day become extremely painful to him. He therefore could not multiply himself, as may be said he had been accustomed to do on the field of battle, where his presence always prompted to vigor and emulation. Sometimes he looked at his watch and doubtless expected Marshal Grouchy at least as impatiently as the Duke of Wellington did Blucher. The fire was animated and murderous. However, in a battle, it is necessary to keep it up to augment it. For the advantage remains with him who has the last weight to throw into the scale. The guard was still in reserve. The moment for striking the decisive blow had arrived, and Grouchy did not appear. The emperor began to feel uneasy, for he calculated every moment, and he knew that the marshal had had sufficient time to receive the order directing him to come up and to execute it. He could not understand why the heads of the column were not yet seen. It was under these circumstances intelligence was brought to the emperor that columns were seen debouching on his right. He believed they were the marshals and went himself to meet them. He soon discovered, however, the mistake, and that instead of the succor he expected, the Prussians were advancing against him. From that moment, he no longer deceived himself as to the result which the battle would have. If Grouchy had joined the emperor at the same time that Blucher came up to Wellington, the battle would have taken another character. It would doubtless have become general, but it cannot be thought that it would have been decisive, because the superiority in numbers would still have been on the enemy's side. It is pretty certain, however, that the emperor would not have been defeated, and that the misfortunes which followed would not have occurred. In order that matters should have happened according to the emperor's plan, it was necessary for Marshal Grouchy's corps to have been on the field of battle at least an hour before Blucher, because the English army would undoubtedly have been then so cut up that the Prussians would have arrived only to augment the confusion and probably to experience another check themselves. Instead of which, the Prussians arrived to the assistance of the English, and Grouchy never appeared. When the emperor saw that he could not reckon on the marshal, he formed his resolution. He tried to execute by his reserve the shock which should have been effected by the marshal. It has been contended that the emperor could have retreated. It might be so. I was not on the ground, and I cannot judge whether the dispersion of the troops, as well as the manner in which they were disposed on the different points of attack, would have allowed the emperor to concentrate them and to effect his retreat before he would have been overwhelmed by the united efforts of the Prussians and the English. For if he could not avoid the enemy, he seized on the only chance of success which fortune had left him by making a vigorous effort with his reserve. Had he even then broken the English army before its complete junction with the Prussians, there would have been no defeat, because the time which must have been occupied on each side in maneuvering would have afforded equal time for Grouchy to arrive. These, doubtless, were the reasons why the emperor, after having recognized the Prussians, brought into action his reserve, which was composed of the guard. That corps presented itself to the enemy as it had been accustomed to do. Not only, however, did it obtain no success, but it was repulsed with loss. In the moment of its vacillation, the enemy's squadron debouched. A general charge took place. All the Prussian cavalry attacked the reserve on its right flank and completed the disorder of our ranks. There remained neither time nor means to arrest the disaster. Every person who has been present at battles, lost or won, cannot but admit that there was nothing extraordinary in the consequence of this charge. They were indeed inevitable. It was the repetition of what always happens when fresh cavalry charge troops exhausted by fatigue and thinned by cannon and musketry. They rarely resist the shock. The squadrons penetrate into the intervals which separate the lines, wheel round and destroy all order in the ranks by intersecting them at all points. In the hottest battles, the moment of the charge is that in which the troops which execute it has the least occasion for the cool courage which the infantry and artillery display in their murderous attacks. For the cavalry, nothing is necessary but rapidity. Terror precedes them, and success follows them. There was not on the plain of Waterloo any obstacle to oppose cavalry. They were free to act as long as their horses had strength to carry them. They took, therefore, whatever they pleased. One thing only is matter of astonishment, and that is that any of the wreck of the army escaped them. In this general disorder, the state of everything was the inverse of what it ought to have been. This is not surprising. All things had been arranged for attack, and therefore all necessarily embarrassed such a retreat. Each scattered fragment of a corps took some direction or other according to the knowledge individuals happened to possess of the localities. Some fled across the fields, others kept to the high road and succeeding in repassing the Sambre. Such was the result of the Battle of Waterloo, which was more fatal to France than Agincourt or Poitiers. That the emperor was not taken himself was because fortune would not have it so. In preceding wars, such an event would have had less fatal consequences. A disaster would have been repaired before the news reached Paris. But at this conjuncture, the details of our misfortune may be said to have even preceded the account of the loss of the battle. I will state the effect which this disaster produced in Paris. Without success, the most brilliant conceptions do not secure approbation. Wherever there is reverse, censure follows. The number of persons who had not suffered any illusions to mislead them as to the result of the contest were very considerable, and to their criticism the emperor could not fail to be exposed. On the other hand, those who had not hesitated to tempt fortune once more in his cause endured with pain the loss of the illusions they had cherished. In proportion as hope was disappointed, the reproaches were the more bitter. The military plan of the campaign was blamed, and the manner in which it was executed was depreciated. Some went so far as to accuse the emperor of having shown a want of personal courage on this occasion. Assuredly, those who dared thus to defame him knew him not. It must be presumed that they never were in the habit of following him to the field of battle with all their courage. And they, no doubt, have much. Would they venture to conquer France with less than 800 men? But time has done justice on these base imputations, and they now serve to confound those by whom they were propagated. At Waterloo, the situation of the emperor resembled that in which he was placed at Marengo. But in the latter battle, he was better served. It may be recollected that after passing the Po near Pavia, he marched to reconnoiter the Austrian army in the hope that he might oblige it to raise the siege of Genoa, and that to prevent it from impeding his passage of the Po at Turin, where it held the citadel, or at Placentia, which was also occupied by the Austrians. He detached a corps of observation on these places, while he himself directed his march with the main body of his army towards Tortona and Alexandria, and thus menaced the great communication of the Genoese territory with Piedmont. It was on the day after he passed the Po that an officer arrived from Messina with the capitulation of Genoa, and that he learned that the Austrian army was returning to Alexandria. The emperor had taken that direction and occupied a position in front of the Bormida to observe the Austrian army. So much did he fear that the enemy would escape him that he ordered General Desaix, who commanded the reserve on his left, to march on Novi to intercept the route and prevent the enemy from reaching Placentia. At daybreak, General Desaix left his position at Rivalta and was marching on Novi when he heard the vigorous cannonade of Marengo. He immediately halted and ordered his advance guard of hussars to push forward on Novi. The hussars penetrated into the town and returned at full gallop with information that there was no force there. I was then his first aide-de-camp, and he sent me to the emperor to report what had occurred and to inform him that he had taken it upon himself to stop his movement. I was crossing the country in the direction of the cannonade when I fell in with an officer sent by the emperor to bring up General Desaix and his troops to the field of battle. It was fortunate that they had not advanced farther in the direction of Novi. But when they arrived at the scene of action, which they also reached by marching across the fields, affairs could not be going on worse. General Desaix had barely time to form his troops. The emperor immediately ordered him to charge a column of the enemy, which was penetrating into the center of the field of battle, where there was not sufficient remaining force to withstand it. The movement of General Desaix and the charge, which the first consul also ordered General Kellerman to execute, secured the victory. But had General Desaix procrastinated and been an hour later in arriving, we should perhaps have been driven to the bow. In fine, had not that general halted on his own responsibility, had he continued his march as his instructions directed on Novi, he would not have arrived in time on the field of battle, where he fell the victim of his patriotic zeal. But the times of such promptitude were gone by, and we were doomed to drain the cup of misfortune to the dregs. Chapter 6. 2 years had elapsed after the conclusion of these memoirs when I read in London the account of the Battle of Waterloo, which was published by General Gourgaud on his return from St. Helena, and also Marshal Grouchy's reply. I had likewise heard other reproaches which were cast upon the marshal on that occasion, but not by the Emperor Napoleon, for I can bear witness that no complaint against any individual escaped him in the painful circumstance in which he was placed during the interval between the fatal battle and his departure for St. Helena. I must now confess that on a perusal of the work published by the son of Marshal Grouchy from materials furnished by his father, I do not find any justification of the reproaches of which he complains. I reply to Monsieur Grouchy himself, and I take him on his own statements. In the Battle of the 16th, which lasted until night, he commanded all the cavalry on the right, about 5,000 strong. The Prussian army retired during the night, and the emperor himself returned to Fleurus. Next day, the 17th, Marshal Grouchy repaired to Fleurus to receive orders. If, instead of going to Fleurus, Monsieur Grouchy had mounted his cavalry and ordered it forward, he would have better ascertained the direction taken by the Prussians, and there is no doubt that if he'd sent positive information obtained by himself of the point where he was certain of finding Blucher's rear guard, the Emperor Napoleon would have been infinitely better able to give the orders which he complains of not having received until noon on the 17th. What business had he at Fleurus on the morning of the 17th, were it not to communicate to the Emperor the result of the reconnaissance of his cavalry? Was the Emperor to divine that Blucher had done during the night? Marshal Grouchy pretends that it was too late when the Emperor detached him, and that the order for marching against the English army was also given too late. This is a strange reproach. The Emperor's orders could be dictated only by the reports of the reconnaissances, which he expected to receive, if not in the night, at least early in the morning. Now Marshal Ney ought to have been on the 16th at the position of Quatre Bras, which was occupied throughout the day only by a brigade of the Duke of Wellington's army, not only failed to be there on the 16th, but was still at Fresnes on the morning of the 17th. In this state of things, the Emperor obliged to send a reconnoitering party selected from the troops about him to Quatre Bras. It was then discovered that the enemy was there. If, then, the morning of the 17th was lost, the blame must rest with those who left the Emperor in a state of uncertainty respecting the movements of the enemy, instead of enabling him to make the most of his time. In this situation in which France then stood, the hours were numbered, and all that happened on this occasion proves that everyone, according to custom, relied implicitly on the Emperor's foresight and activity. In these circumstances of inaction, how can Monsieur de Grouchy be astonished that the soldiers should have employed the time in cleaning their arms and preparing their soup? Was it for the Emperor to prevent them?